Hello, it's me, Mark Anderson, and this is part 2 of our discussion on industry analysis. We're continuing to look at Porter's 5 forces, and as I've said in the previous video, this is the typical way in which Porter's 5 forces framework is depicted. In this section, we're going to look in more detail at the components of each of these 5 forces. Ultimately, the objective of a 5 forces analysis is to determine the level of each of these 5 forces. And the level might be described in pretty broad terms of low, medium or high. But in order to determine that, we need to understand what contributes to the level of each force, what are the various components of each force, and to what extent are they present in the industry which we're interested in, so that we can come to an overall understanding of where the power lies in these different industries that we might be looking at. And these varying levels of power between the different forces and the different reasons for those different levels of power determines the level of profitability and therefore the attraction of a particular industry, or of course, to be more accurate, the attraction of a particular strategic group within a particular industry. So let's run through the 5 different forces in detail. When we consider the level of threat of entry, what we have to understand is the extent to which barriers to entry exist. So the more barriers to entry that exist, the more difficult it is to enter an industry. So therefore the threat of entry will be low. The lower the barriers to entry, then the higher will be the threat of entry. The barriers to entry are features such as, are economies of scale necessary to operate in the industry? So in some, for example, process industries, manufacturing steel, manufacturing cars, you need to have a large scale of manufacture in order to keep your unit costs low. If you have low unit costs, which you've acquired through economies of scale, then it's very difficult for a new entrant to come along and from the beginning actually have the benefit of those low unit costs, because they won't initially have the scale. So that keeps people out because they can't compete. Their profit will be much, much lower than yours. In fact, they may initially make losses. In order to set up the firm, often requires capital. The more capital that's required, the higher the barrier to entry, so the less the threat of entry. For example, some firms like pharmaceuticals, car manufacture, steel processing, need very large sums of capital. So not many firms are in a position to easily enter those particular industries. So the barriers to entry are high, the threat of entry is low. In some industries, existing firms may have preferential terms or access to supply or distribution channels. If a new entrant can't break into those channels, then it's difficult for them to enter, so the threat of entry is low. Similarly, there may be very high levels of customer or supplier loyalty existing for existing incumbents in the industry, and that makes it difficult for new entrants. Many industries require a large amount of experience or knowledge in order to be able to operate successfully. Without that experience, there are large barriers to entry. Of course, if somebody new comes along to the industry, the existing companies don't often just sit back and allow them to get on with business. They retaliate in some way. That might be through lowering their prices. It might be through making better offers of some sort to their existing customers. It might even be taking some form of legal action to try and keep the new entrants out. The more retaliation that's likely, the higher the barrier to entry. Legislation or government action can often either close a market or open a market. So the budget airline industry was created when the legislation across Europe allowed new companies to set up as airlines and fly within European airspace. That had the effect of reducing the existing barrier to entry, which was great for new firms like EasyJet and Ryanair, but caused a huge problem for the incumbent flag carriers such as British Airways and Lufthansa. The more that an industry has differentiation amongst the various different firms, the more difficult it is for a new firm to enter. If there are lots of different sorts of offers available to current customers, then it's difficult to enter. If everybody's operating the same, low prices, low quality, then it's easier, I should say, for a new firm to come along and enter. Not all of these characteristics or features will be present in any industry at one time. So when assessing the threat of entry, we need to look at all these different types of barriers to entry and see to what extent any of them might be present in the industry which we're assessing. The second force that we consider is the threat of substitutes. Importantly, we should remember that substitutes come from outside the industry. So Pepsi is a competitor of Coca-Cola. It's not a substitute. It's already in the carbonated drinks market. Water or orange juice come from outside the carbonated or fizzy drinks market, so they could be a substitute. Substitutes cause the problem that they reduce demand for the industry products, and therefore they're reducing the size of the market, reducing potentially the volume of sales available to the incumbents. So that has a knock-on effect that starts to reduce the level of profits and profitability which any particular firm can earn. Often, particularly as new technology arrives, then different industries start to converge. So we start to see what were previously substitutes then actually being part of the industry. So if we look at the way Apple has grown over the years, the markets they operated have now converged remarkably. So how do we define a market which some of the Apple products operate in? Are they computers? Are they phones? Are they cameras? They've managed to converge a number of different previously separate industries. Another point to consider about substitutes is it's not all about price. People don't look for other products in different industries or from different industries purely on the base of price. But often more important, it's what's the total solution that they offer. So that we can see that Apple win out because they've converged all sorts of different types of function into one small handheld product. So the difficulty with substitutes is they can be difficult to spot. But there are different ways in which substitution can arise. It might be straightforward product for product substitution. So how many of you have recently sent a letter? Conversely, how many of you even now at this very moment might be receiving or sending a text or an email? So the Royal Mail has been suffering considerably over the last 10 years or more because of the rise of alternative ways of communicating, all at the expense of the good old favourite letter. Another form of substitution can be seen where a product is completely replaced, or rather a function is replaced. So how many people now buy 35mm film before they go on their holidays? Very, very few, because we now no longer need the film and film processing industry because everything is done digitally. Again, also, perhaps thanks very much to people like Apple and others. Another form of slightly different substitution is generic substitution. If I was fortunate enough to win the lottery this week, I might have a large sum of money and I could have a choice of what I spend it on. Would I buy myself a nice Italian sports car? Or would I be more generous and treat my whole family and dog to a nice expensive holiday. What I chose to spend my money on would be in different industries. They're not competing directly with each other, but they are competing for my expenditure. So spotting generic substitution can be very difficult indeed. But the more substitution that exists, or the possibility of substitution that exists in industry, the smaller that industry will become, so the more competitive it will become, and profitability will start to decline. The next important force to look at is the power of buyers. Now, the buyers are the people who buy from the industry. So if we were to think of the grocery market in the UK, then we all are the buyers, the direct buyers from that industry. So buying power is likely to be high when there are very few buyers, which isn't the case, of course, in the UK grocery market. There are millions and millions of buyers. But if you were to consider the pharmaceutical market in the UK, then there are 5 or 6 large pharmaceutical companies, but the principal buyer is the UK government or the National Health Service. So that single buyer has the ability to negotiate very hard with those variety of buyers. With the number of industry players, companies in that industry sector. If the industry is fragmented, so lots and lots of small companies, that gives the buyers choice. And the more choice that the buyers have, the more power they have to go from one to another choice of company in that industry. That power becomes even stronger if the cost of moving from one company to another one is very low. So in the case of the grocery market in the UK, although there are millions and millions of buyers, and there's only a handful, well, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 potential companies from whom we might buy our groceries, it costs us nothing to move from one firm to another. And when we talk about switching costs, we're not talking about the cost of buying a product from one firm or another firm. We're talking about the costs that surround that actual move. So for individuals, there's no risk for us to change our mind and go to Tesco rather than Asda. There's no actual extra expenditure. So where we've got low switching costs and we can easily see the offers available from the different firms in the industry, then our power as buyers starts to increase. Of course, if switching costs are high, so think about contracts that you might take out with mobile phone suppliers, then it costs you money to cancel that contract perhaps and move to another firm. So in that case, switching costs are high and our power as buyers is reduced. If the particular product, the component or materials which we're buying are a high percentage of our expenditure, and this applies to individuals as well as to firms, then we might take far more attention over choosing who we're going to buy from, and we might start to try and play one off against the other because there's a big saving perhaps for us to make. So that starts to give us more power. If there's the possibility that we can't come to agreeable terms with a particular firm, and that we can actually then buy that firm, never mind just buying the products, but we buy the firm and maybe gain security of supply, we have more control over service or product development, then that gives us a huge amount of buying power. The next force to consider is the power of suppliers. One thing you must bear in mind is that suppliers and buyers in the 5 forces framework are completely separate. And what goes on under supplier power is completely separate to buying power. So suppliers, if we're thinking back to our example of UK grocery retailers, Tesco's, Asda, Sainsbury's and so forth, their suppliers are people like farmers, food processors and manufacturers, IT suppliers, property maintenance, construction companies, employees. all those elements, those resources that they need in order to conduct their business. So supplier power is high when there are very few suppliers. So the firms in the industry have little choice, and those suppliers can start to dictate the price which the industry has to pay. If it's difficult to move away from a chosen supplier, i.e. the switching costs are high, then again the suppliers maintain the power. If you think of an IT contract, then a firm that's taken it initially might have a lot of choice over which hardware and software and what supplier they're going to use for that particular resource. But when subsequently they want an update to their software, they can probably only go back to that original supplier. So then the switching costs are very high, and any subsequent work that IT supplier is asked to perform, they can charge a high price for, because what's the alternative? Who else can you get to do it? So if there are high switching costs, if you've locked your customers in as a supplier, then you're maintaining power. If the supplier brand is powerful, think of Kellogg's, Coca-Cola. They're products that we all like to buy and see on supermarkets' shelves. If our chosen supermarket didn't stock those brands for some reason, then we might well stop going to that particular supermarket. So that those brands can negotiate more strongly with retailers to ensure that maybe they get more shelf space, maybe they get slightly higher prices. If there's the possibility that the supplier can move forward and buy their customers, so actually buy the firms in the industry, then that gives them enormous amount of power. The importance of supply and power is that the suppliers can dictate the costs which the industries have to pay. The higher the costs the industry have to pay, then the lower the profit they can make. The final force to consider then is competitive rivalry. And rivalry, as I mentioned earlier, is affected by the level of the other forces, the other four forces, but it also has some other distinct components. If all the competitors in the industry are of similar size, similar power, all jostling for position, they all want to grow, then the rivalry is likely to be high. Because for one competitor to grow, they've got to take market share, revenue from one of their direct competitors. And of course that competitor doesn't want that to allow that to happen. So they will fight on price, on service, product range, and so forth in order to make sure that they get the business. So if you look particularly at UK grocers, then there are big banner headlines as they're all in a price war to try and make sure that bread or milk or one of the essentials is a lower price than at the other retailers, to try and make sure that they get the customers in through the door. This balance between the competitors in the industry is made worse if there is very slow market growth. So if a market's growing nicely and quickly, then there's plenty of growth for all the players in that industry. They don't necessarily have to compete too strongly against each other. They just have to grow and expand and take up some of that market growth. If the slow market growth, and UK groceries is a good example of slow market growth. You know, the market doesn't grow much more than 3% because there's a limit to how much more we can eat every year. Then that gives even more rivalry, because what growth there is, they all want to gain at the cost for the other competitors. If there are high fixed costs, so you've got high capital costs to invest, you've got lots of assets, and you need high volume in order to make a profit, then quite often, particularly in a downward economic cycle where demand might start to fall, then competition starts to rise because all the companies are concentrating on at least breaking even. They need a minimum volume in order to break even, never mind about making a profit. So again, you'll see lots of price cuts. And this was a typical market behavior at the time of the economic crisis, 2008 and onwards, that could be seen in the car industry, where new cars were discounted and discounted and discounted because the car manufacturers have high fixed costs. They've got to sell a certain volume of product in order to just survive. If there are high exit barriers, so it's very difficult to get out of an industry, and again, an industry like the car industry is a good example, there is not much value in a second-hand car manufacturing plant, particularly at a time when there's a crisis on and nobody wants that extra volume. So if it's going to cost a lot of money, or maybe if there's going to be a high political cost, if a big firm closes down, there's high unemployment, then that has high political costs. So think particularly about the negotiations that are going on around the closure of steel plants in Wales and elsewhere, where there is a high barrier to exiting that industry. So the firm might try and stay in to carry on and compete more strongly in order to stay in the industry. Again, as in the threat of entry, if markets are undifferentiated, if it's really a commodity market sold at a base level, the low price, then it's highly rivalrous. In the next section, we'll look more closely about actually conducting a five forces analysis.